Hello everyone. I'm Horror Whispers. A large number of viewers aren't yet subscribed. If you enjoy these stories, please consider subscribing. It's free and greatly supports the channel. Your likes, comments, and shares help us grow and reach more people. I'd also love to know where you're watching from. Share it in the comments. At 3:47 a.m. on Alaska's deadliest highway, Marcus saw 5 phantom trucks in his mirror where no vehicles should be. Sarah picked up a hitchhiker in a -62 blizzard who whispered, "I've been waiting since 1987. Jim fueled up at a station that charged him 847 hours instead of dollars. These aren't legends. They're true confessions from truckers who faced Alaska's supernatural highways. My name's Marcus Rodriguez, and I've been running freight between Fairbanks and Whitehorse for 12 years. I thought I'd seen everything these frozen highways could throw at a driver, until that night at the Yukon River crossing changed my understanding of what's possible in Alaska's endless darkness. It was February 14th, Valentine's Day, though romance was the last thing on my mind as I fought through one of the worst cold snaps in recent memory. The thermometer on my dashboard read -62 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze diesel fuel in your lines if you weren't careful, cold enough to kill you in minutes if your truck broke down. I was hauling a full load of mining equipment bound for a gold operation near Dawson City, heavy machinery that would help some corporation tear more wealth from the frozen ground, and I was making good time despite the brutal conditions that had kept most other drivers off the road. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of me, a ribbon of black asphalt cutting through wilderness so vast and empty, it made you feel like the last person alive on Earth. My headlights carved through the darkness, illuminating swirling snow that danced across the road like ghostly figures, and the only sounds were the steady rumble of my diesel engine and the occasional crackle of static from my CB radio. That's when I saw the first light, appearing like a crimson star about a mile ahead, pulsing slowly in a rhythm that seemed almost organic, almost alive. My initial thought was emergency vehicles, maybe an accident or a stranded motorist, which wouldn't be unusual in these conditions where temperatures could kill faster than bullets. But as I closed the distance, something felt fundamentally wrong about what I was seeing. The lights weren't on the ground where they should be. They were floating approximately 10 feet above the highway, suspended in the air with no visible means of support, moving in patterns that defied everything I understood about physics and the natural world. Red and blue pulses that seemed to communicate with each other, dancing through the air like living things made of pure energy. I grabbed my CB radio with hands that had started trembling, though I told myself it was just the cold seeping through my heated cab. Breaker 19. This is northbound Marcus heading for the Yukon crossing. Anyone else seeing these lights up ahead? Nothing but static answered me, the kind of deep rolling static that seemed to carry voices just brighter as they approached. And I realized they weren't just red and blue anymore, but cycling through colors that didn't have names, hues that hurt to look at directly and seemed to bypass my eyes and burn directly into my brain. That's when I heard the voices, not through my CB radio speakers, but somehow coming from the radio itself. Multiple voices overlapping and interweaving, speaking in a language I'd never heard before, but somehow understood with perfect clarity. The voices were ancient, tired, and carried an authority that made my bones ache. "Turn back, Marcus Rodriguez," they said, and hearing my full name spoken by these impossible entities made ice water flow through my veins. "The crossing is closed. The crossing has always been closed. Turn back while you still remember the way home." I pressed my foot down hard on the accelerator, my survival instincts overriding the paralysis of terror that had been creeping up my spine. Whatever was happening here, whatever these things were, I knew with absolute certainty that stopping would be the last mistake I'd ever make. My truck surged forward, the diesel engine roaring as I pushed it harder than I'd ever pushed it before. But the lights kept pace effortlessly, floating alongside my speeding vehicle, like they were connected to it by invisible chains. For 5 endless miles they followed me, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes surrounding my truck completely, until I felt like I was driving through a tunnel made of living light. Then, at mile marker 142, they simply vanished. One moment they were there, pulsing and dancing around my truck like predators circling prey, and the next moment the highway was empty and dark, except for my own headlights cutting through the night. I didn't slow down, didn't stop to investigate or try to make sense of what had happened. I kept my foot on the gas and didn't ease up until I saw the blessed lights of Whitehorse 8 hours later, civilization never looking so beautiful or welcoming. When I finally felt safe enough to examine my CB radio, I discovered something that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. The radio was tuned to channel 19.25, a frequency that doesn't exist in any official documentation, a channel that shouldn't be possible with standard CB equipment. My name is Sarah Chen, and I've been driving Alaska's most treacherous highways for 15 years, hauling everything from medical supplies to construction equipment across distances that would terrify most people. I thought I understood the dangers of this job. Black ice that could send your rig tumbling into a canyon, temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in under 2 minutes, and isolation so complete that a breakdown could mean death before help arrives. What I didn't understand was that sometimes the most dangerous thing on these roads isn't the weather or the terrain, but the things that shouldn't exist. The passengers who climb into your cab and change your life forever. It happened on the Glen Highway during one of the worst blizzards I'd ever encountered. A whiteout so complete, it was like driving through the inside of a ping-pong ball, where visibility dropped to 0 and the world outside my windshield became a swirling wall of death. I was crawling along at 15 miles per hour, following my GPS and praying to whatever gods protect foolish truckers that I wouldn't slide off into the canyon that lurked somewhere to my right. The wind was howling like a living thing, rocking my fully loaded 18-wheeler back and forth despite its massive weight, and ice was building up on my wipers faster than they could clear it away. The radio had been silent for hours except for emergency broadcasts, warning people to stay off the roads, advice that came too late for drivers like me, who were already committed to routes that had no safe places to stop. That's when I saw her through the swirling snow, a figure standing on the shoulder like she was waiting for a bus in downtown Anchorage, instead of facing certain death in the worst blizzard in recent memory. She was wearing a summer dress, light blue with small white flowers, the kind of outfit you'd wear to a picnic or a church social, completely inappropriate for conditions that were killing the landscape around us. No coat, no gloves, no hat or boots, just standing there motionless as snow accumulated on her shoulders and hair, without her making any effort to brush it away. My first instinct was to keep driving, to follow company policy about not picking up hitchhikers under any circumstances, but leaving someone to die in these conditions would haunt me for the rest of my life. And despite 15 years of seeing the worst that Alaska could offer, outside. She climbed in without a word, settling into the passenger seat with the careful movements of someone who had done this many times before. And when she finally spoke, her voice was soft and musical, with an accent I couldn't quite place. "Thank you," she said, turning to look at me with eyes that seemed too deep, too knowing for someone who appeared to be in her early 20s. "I've been waiting so long for someone to stop." She wasn't shivering, wasn't showing any signs of hypothermia or frostbite, despite having been standing in sub-zero temperatures wearing summer clothes. Her skin was pale, almost luminous in the dim light of my cab, and I noticed with growing unease that I couldn't see any condensation from her breath, despite the cold that was still seeping through my windows and doors. We drove in silence for 20 minutes, the only sounds the laboring of my engine and the howling of wind that seemed to be growing more aggressive, more personal, as if the storm was angry that I had interfered with something that was none of my business. I kept glancing at her in my peripheral vision, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And that's when I noticed the impossible detail that made my blood run cold in my veins. She wasn't breathing. Her chest never rose or fell. There was no rhythm of inhalation and exhalation that marks every living thing, no sign that oxygen was moving in and out of her lungs. "How long have you been waiting out there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to let the growing terror show in my tone. She turned to look at me directly, and when our eyes met, I saw something that will haunt me until the day I die. Her eyes weren't reflecting any light from my dashboard or headlights. They were completely black, like looking into deep water on a moonless night, like staring into the space between stars where nothing has ever lived. "Since 1987, she said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather or the condition of the roads. "The night my car went over the guardrail just ahead. I've been waiting for someone to give me a ride home ever since." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I slammed on the brakes instinctively, my truck skidding to a stop on the icy highway. When I turned to confront her, to demand answers or call for help, blizzard. Her body was never recovered from the canyon below. My name is Jim Rodriguez, and I've been hauling freight on the Dalton Highway to Prudhoe Bay for 22 years, making the grueling 414-mile journey through some of the most desolate and unforgiving terrain on the planet. The haul road, as we call it, is a ribbon of gravel and asphalt that cuts through the heart of Alaska's wilderness, connecting the oil fields of the North Slope to the rest of civilization through hundreds of miles of tundra, mountains, and endless emptiness where a broken axle or empty fuel tank can mean death. I thought I knew every mile marker, every truck stop, every landmark along that route like the back of my hand, which is why what happened at mile marker 237 shattered everything I believed about the nature of reality and left me questioning whether some places exist outside the normal rules of time and space. It was my third day on a supply run, hauling drilling equipment and replacement parts for the rigs that never stop working in their quest to pull black gold from the frozen earth. My fuel gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty, and I hadn't seen a gas station in over 150 miles of driving through landscape so barren it looked like the surface of an alien planet. The nearest fuel stop, according to my GPS, was still 80 miles ahead, a distance that would leave me stranded in wilderness where the temperature could drop to 50 below zero without warning. That's when I spotted the sign emerging from the darkness ahead, illuminated by my headlights like a beacon of salvation in the endless night. "Last Chance Fuel, mile 237, read the weathered sign, pointing toward a gravel access road that led into the darkness beyond my headlight beams. The strange thing was, I had driven this exact route more than 100 times over the years, memorizing every curve and landmark out of necessity, and there had never been a fuel stop at mile 237. But there it was, clear as daylight, with a neon sign buzzing and flickering in the distance, casting red and blue light across the snow-covered tundra like some kind of oasis in the frozen desert. I pulled off the highway and followed the access road for maybe half a mile, gravel crunching under my tires as I approached what looked like a standard truck stop from the 1970s, complete with old-fashioned pumps and a small building that housed what I assumed was a convenience store and office. The attendant was waiting for a cab, grateful for the opportunity to stretch my legs and grab some coffee and snacks for the remainder of my journey. Inside the building, everything felt subtly wrong in ways that I couldn't immediately identify. The place was too clean, too bright, with fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency that made my teeth ache. The shelves were stocked with snacks and supplies, but when I looked closer, I noticed that all the magazines on the rack were from 1979, their covers faded but somehow still crisp and new-looking. The milk in the cooler had expiration dates from 30 years ago, yet it appeared fresh and cold, condensation beating on the containers as if it had just been delivered. When I returned to my truck, the attendant was just finishing with the fuel pump, and he turned to me with that same unsettling smile that seemed painted on his face. "That'll be $847, he said, holding out a receipt that looked like it had been printed on some kind of antique machine. $847 for a tank of diesel seemed impossible, even accounting for remote location markup, and I started to argue until I noticed something that made my blood run cold in my veins. The display on the fuel pump wasn't showing dollar amounts at all. Instead, it was showing hours, counting upward in a steady digital progression that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my own heartbeat. 847 hours, the display read, and as I watched in growing horror, the number continued to climb. 848 hours, 849 hours, 850 hours. Hours until what? I asked, my voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. The attendant's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white and too sharp, and for just a moment, his entire face seemed to flicker like a television with bad reception, showing something underneath that was definitely not human. "Until you come back, Mr. Rodriguez," he said, and hearing my name spoken by this impossible entity made ice water flow through my veins. "Until you always come back. Time works differently here, you see. Some debts can't be paid with money. Some transactions require something much more valuable than cash." I threw a $100 bill at him and ran for my truck, my hands shaking as I started the engine and peeled out of there, gravel flying from my tires. Terror of the day when that countdown reaches its end. My name is Dave Thompson, and I've been hauling freight through Alaska's most remote wilderness areas for 18 years, specializing in deliveries to mining camps and research stations that exist so far off the grid that GPS satellites sometimes lose track of their coordinates. I thought I understood the wildlife that inhabits these frozen wastelands, from massive grizzly bears that can weigh over 1,000 pounds to wolves that hunt in packs across hundreds of square miles of territory. What I discovered near Coldfoot last winter challenged everything I believed about what kinds of creatures can survive in Alaska's brutal environment, and the photographs I took that night continue to haunt me with questions that no wildlife expert has been able to answer. It was late March, during that strange period when winter begins to loosen its grip on the land, but temperatures still drop to 30 below zero without warning. I was returning from a supply run to a geological survey team working near the Arctic Circle, hauling empty containers and exhausted from 3 days of fighting through some of the worst road conditions I'd ever encountered. About 50 miles south of Coldfoot, I pulled over to check my load straps and make sure the shifting cargo hadn't damaged anything during the brutal journey over roads that could charitably be called controlled avalanches of gravel and ice. That's when I noticed them in the beam of my flashlight. Footprints in the snow leading away from the highway toward a dense grove of stunted spruce trees that had somehow managed to survive in this harsh landscape. But these weren't tracks from any animal I'd ever seen in nearly 2 decades of wilderness driving. Each print was roughly circular, about the size of a dinner plate, pressed deep into packed snow that should have been too frozen to take such clear impressions. The most disturbing detail was that each track showed only 3 toes, massive clawed appendages that had gouged deep grooves in the ice as whatever made them had walked with obvious weight and purpose. Curiosity overrode my better judgment, and I decided to follow the tracks with my high-powered flashlight, snapping photographs as I went because I knew nobody would believe what I was seeing without concrete evidence. The prints led in a perfectly straight line across the barren landscape, never deviating around obstacles or showing any sign that the creature had paused to investigate its surroundings. Whatever had made these tracks gait with strides that covered nearly 4 feet of ground with each step. The depth and clarity of the impressions indicated that the tracks were fresh, made within the last few hours, which meant that this massive unknown creature was somewhere nearby in the darkness that surrounded my small island of light. As I followed the trail deeper into the wilderness, I began to notice something that defied all logic and reason. The tracks only went in one direction, leading away from the highway toward the grove of dead trees about 200 yards from where I had parked my truck. There were no return tracks, no signs that whatever had made these impressions had ever walked back toward the road or turned around to retrace its path. It was as if the creature had simply materialized at the highway's edge and walked in a straight line toward some destination that only it could perceive, leaving behind evidence of its passage, but no clue about where it had come from or how it had arrived at that spot. The silence in the wilderness was absolute, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground and the distant whisper of wind through bare branches. That's when I heard the sound that made my blood freeze in my veins, a low rumbling that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself, like the idle of a massive diesel engine, but organic and alive. The sound was emanating from somewhere within the grove of dead trees, rhythmic and deliberate, and as I stood there listening in growing terror, I realized it was the sound of something breathing. I called out into the darkness, "Hello, anyone there?" hoping against hope that I would discover some rational explanation for what I was experiencing. The breathing stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the entire wilderness was holding its breath. Then I heard something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. The unmistakable sound of something massive moving carefully through the trees, trying to remain hidden while simultaneously aware that it was being observed. Heavy footsteps, too heavy to belong to any known animal, moved through the grove with surprising stealth for something of such enormous size. I caught glimpses of movement between the trees, a shadow that seemed to shift and flow in ways that hurt my eyes to follow, something tall and imposing that definitely did not belong in any classification of Arctic wildlife that I had ever studied. My panic with what felt like amusement. When I finally reached my truck and developed the photographs back in Fairbanks, the tracks were clearly visible in every image except the last one, the final shot I had taken just before my nerve broke and I ran for safety. In that last photograph, standing among the dead trees like it belonged there, was a shadow in the shape of something that stood upright but was definitely not human, watching me with what appeared to be ancient patience, as if it had been waiting in that grove for decades or centuries for someone curious enough to follow its tracks that led nowhere. My name is Lisa Park, and I've been running ice roads through Alaska's most treacherous territories for 8 years, specializing in the kind of extreme weather deliveries that most drivers won't even attempt. Ice fog is one of the most dangerous phenomena you can encounter in the Arctic, a meteorological nightmare that forms when temperatures drop so low that moisture in the air crystallizes instantly, creating walls of glittering particles that can reduce visibility to absolute zero in a matter of seconds. Most truckers pull over and wait when ice fog rolls in, but deadlines and corporate pressure sometimes force you to keep moving through conditions that should terrify any rational person. What happened to me last January on the Dalton Highway taught me that ice fog doesn't just hide the familiar world from view. It reveals things that should never be seen by human eyes. I was heading north toward Prudhoe Bay with a load of replacement drilling equipment, running behind schedule due to a series of mechanical problems that had plagued me since leaving Fairbanks 3 days earlier. The weather had been cooperating for most of the journey, with clear skies and manageable temperatures hovering around -20 degrees, cold but not life-threatening for an experienced driver with proper equipment and preparation. That changed without warning just south of the Brooks Range, when the temperature gauge on my dashboard suddenly plummeted to -58 degrees, and the world around my truck transformed into something from another planet. Ice fog materialized around me like a living thing, rolling across the landscape in waves that seemed to have intelligence and purpose behind their movement. One moment I could see for miles across the barren tundra. The next I was driving blind through a cloud of ice crystals so dense it felt like being inside a snow globe that was being shaken by invisible hands. I slowed to a crawl and activated every light on my truck, creating a small bubble of illumination that extended maybe 20 feet in any direction, beyond which existed only swirling walls of crystallized moisture that reflected my headlights back at me like a hall of mirrors. That's when I saw the first pair of eyes floating in the fog ahead of me, approximately 8 feet off the ground and glowing with a pale yellow light that seemed to come from within, rather than reflecting any external source. My initial reaction was confusion rather than fear, assuming they must be the headlights of another vehicle, or perhaps some kind of reflection from my own light. Simply blinked again, and began moving in a slow circle around my truck, always maintaining the same distance, always at the same impossible height above the ground. That's when I noticed the second pair of eyes, and the third, and within minutes I was surrounded by dozens of them, floating at various heights throughout the ice fog, like some kind of supernatural constellation that had descended from the Arctic sky to examine this noisy intruder in their frozen domain. The eyes were all similar in basic structure, but varied in subtle ways that suggested different individuals, rather than multiple sightings of the same creature. Some were larger, some smaller, some glowed brighter while others pulsed with a dimmer light that seemed to breathe in rhythm with something I couldn't see. The pupils were vertical slits like those of a cat, but the eyes themselves were far too large to belong to any feline species, roughly the size of dinner plates and possessing a depth that suggested intelligence far beyond anything I had encountered in Alaska's wildlife during my years of wilderness driving. I kept my hand pressed on the air horn and tried to push forward through the supernatural gathering, hoping that movement and noise would convince whatever these things were to leave me alone and return to whatever dark corners of the wilderness they had emerged from. The eyes parted like a curtain as I advanced, flowing around my truck in patterns that seemed choreographed, staying just outside the reach of my headlight beams, while clearly tracking my every movement. I could hear them moving through the ice fog, not the sound of footsteps or paws on frozen ground, but a sliding, dragging sound like something massive being pulled across ice by invisible forces. That's when one of them spoke to me, not through my CB radio or any external source, but directly into my mind with a voice that bypassed my ears entirely and resonated inside my skull like the memory of a whisper. "Why do you bring light to our darkness, Lisa Park?" it asked, and hearing my full name spoken by this impossible entity made every nerve in my body scream warnings about dangers that existed beyond human comprehension. More voices joined the first, creating a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from every direction at once, layering over each other in harmonies that were both beautiful and terrifying. "Turn off the lights, Lisa Park. Join us in the darkness where it is so much warmer, so much safer," a point where any alternative seemed appealing. But survival instincts that had kept me alive through countless dangerous situations overrode the supernatural compulsion, and I gunned my engine and burst through the ice fog bank like I was breaking through the surface of deep water after nearly drowning. In my mirrors, I watched the ice fog close behind me like a door sealing shut, trapping whatever lived within that crystallized nightmare in their preferred environment of cold and darkness. But the eyes followed me for another 10 miles beyond the fog bank, floating alongside my truck at highway speed, watching me with what felt like disappointment before finally fading away into the Arctic night, leaving me alone with questions that no amount of research or expert consultation has ever been able to answer. My name is Tom Bradley, and I've been navigating Alaska's most remote highways for 19 years, hauling everything from medical supplies to mining equipment across distances that would break most drivers' spirits and bank accounts. The isolation of these routes means you learn to be self-sufficient, to carry emergency gear, and to never count on help arriving quickly when things go wrong. What happened at Moose Creek last winter taught me that some places exist in a state of perpetual waiting, trapped between what was and what should be, where the past refuses to die, and the living can become permanently lost if they're not careful about which doors they choose to open. I was returning from a delivery to a research station near the Arctic Circle when my transmission started making the grinding noise that every trucker dreads, the metallic screech that means expensive repairs and days of downtime in a business where time literally equals money. About 2 miles past Moose Creek, the grinding became so severe that I had to pull over before the transmission destroyed itself completely, leaving me stranded in wilderness where the nearest mechanic was more than 200 miles away, and winter temperatures could kill you in less than an hour if your truck's heating system failed. I called for a tow truck on my CB radio, but the dispatcher informed me that it would be at least 6 hours before anyone could reach my location, assuming the weather didn't worsen and make the journey impossible for their equipment. 6 hours sitting in a disabled truck in sub-zero temperatures wasn't a death sentence if my heater kept working, but it wasn't a comfortable prospect either, especially with storm clouds gathering on the horizon and the wind beginning to pick up in ways that suggested a serious weather system was moving in. That's when I noticed the light cutting through the darkness about a quarter mile off the highway, tucked back among a grove of stunted spruce trees that had somehow managed to survive in this harsh landscape. It was warm and yellow, the kind of welcoming glow that promises heat and shelter, and maybe a hot cup of coffee to help pass the time until help arrives. The light was coming from what appeared to be a small log cabin, and despite 19 years of experience telling me that most buildings this far from civilization were abandoned or dangerous, the prospect of warmth and shelter overrode my better judgment. I grabbed my flashlight and emergency pack and hiked through snow that came up to my knees, was rising from a stone chimney. All signs that someone was actively maintaining the property. I knocked on the wooden door and called out, "Hello? Anyone home? My truck broke down on the highway and I was wondering if I could use your phone or maybe wait inside until my tow truck arrives." There was no immediate response, but I could hear something playing inside, music that sounded like it was coming from an old radio, big band era songs with the scratchy quality of recordings from the 1940s. The door was unlocked, which surprised me but wasn't entirely unusual in remote areas where neighbors help neighbors, and locking doors is often considered unnecessary. Inside, the cabin was everything you'd expect from the exterior view, with rough-hewn furniture, a wood-burning stove that was radiating comfortable heat, and oil lamps providing the warm light I had seen from the highway. But despite the welcoming atmosphere and signs of recent habitation, everything was covered with a thick layer of dust that suggested the place had been empty for years, possibly decades. The dust coated every surface like gray snow, undisturbed except for my own footprints tracking across the wooden floor. The radio sitting on a corner table was playing that scratchy big band music, but when I examined it more closely, I discovered something that made my skin crawl with unnatural dread. The radio wasn't plugged into any power source that I could see, no electrical cord connecting it to an outlet, no batteries visible in the battery compartment, just playing by itself as if powered by some source that existed beyond normal understanding. The music had a hypnotic quality, drawing me deeper into the cabin's warm embrace and making me forget about the cold truck waiting on the highway and the tow truck that was supposed to rescue me from this wilderness. I noticed a calendar hanging on the wall near the kitchen area, its pages yellowed with age but still clearly readable. December 1947, it read, and today's date was circled in red ink that looked fresh despite the calendar's obvious age. As I stood there staring at that impossible date, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, the music from the radio stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the entire world was holding its breath and waiting for something terrible to happen. In that absolute silence, I became aware of breathing that wasn't my own. Me understand I was not welcome in this place. I ran from that cabin without looking back, abandoning any thought of shelter or warmth in favor of getting as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was breathing in those back rooms. But as my tow truck finally arrived 3 hours early and we prepared to leave, I couldn't resist looking back toward the grove of trees where the cabin sat in its pool of impossible light. There was a figure standing in the front window, silhouetted against the warm glow, watching our departure with what felt like disappointment, as if I had been invited to stay permanently and had rudely declined the offer. Research later revealed that the cabin had belonged to a trapper named Samuel Cross, who disappeared in December 1947 during one of the worst blizzards in Alaska's recorded history. His body was found the following spring, but according to the coroner's report, he had been dead for months, frozen solid in his cabin while winter raged around him. Every year since then, truckers and travelers report seeing that same warm light glowing in the wilderness. And every year, someone new goes missing on that stretch of highway, as if Samuel Cross is still welcoming visitors to his eternal winter home. My name is Carl Jensen, and I've been hauling freight to the oil fields of Prudhoe Bay for 25 years, long enough to understand that the Dalton Highway follows its own rules and punishes drivers who don't respect the isolation and unpredictability of Alaska's most dangerous road. The haul road stretches 414 miles through wilderness so remote that a breakdown can mean death, which is why we always travel in convoy when possible, maintaining radio contact and watching each other's backs through conditions that would terrify most people. What happened during a routine convoy run last October shattered my understanding of reality and left me questioning whether some roads collect more than just accidents and breakdowns over the decades of their existence. I was running second position in a 4-truck convoy, hauling drilling mud and replacement parts for the rigs that never stop working in their quest to extract oil from the North Slope's frozen ground. Rodriguez was running lead in his red Kenworth. I was following in my blue Peterbilt. Patterson was third in his white Freightliner, and Williams was running sweep in his green Mack. All of us experienced drivers who had made this run hundreds of times and knew the importance of staying together in hostile territory, where help could be days away if something went wrong. We maintained strict radio protocol, checking in every 10 minutes to confirm positions and road conditions, sharing information about weather, traffic, and potential hazards that could affect the entire convoy. The system had kept us safe through countless trips, creating a mobile support network that could respond to emergencies faster than any official rescue service could reach our remote location. That's why what I observed in my mirrors during the first 100 miles of our journey filled me with a dread that had nothing to do with mechanical failures or weather conditions. According to my radio, all 4 trucks were maintaining proper formation and making good time despite deteriorating road conditions that required careful navigation around frost heaves and patches of black ice. Rodriguez called back regularly from the lead position, "Convoy leader to all trucks, how's everyone doing back there?" and received prompt responses from Patterson and Williams, confirming their positions and status. But when I looked in my mirrors, I could only see 2 sets of taillights behind me, instead of the 3 that should have been visible in a 4-truck convoy. I called Patterson on the radio. "Patterson, you copy?" Running lights and reflectors creating a bright beacon in the Arctic night. Rodriguez must have sensed something was wrong because he called for a convoy status check, asking each driver to confirm their position and vehicle condition. All 4 of us responded in order, our voices clear and strong over the CB radio. But the visual evidence of my mirrors told a completely different story. I could see Rodriguez ahead of me, his red taillights cutting through the darkness like electronic eyes, but behind me was only the empty highway disappearing into blackness, no sign of Patterson or Williams despite their continued radio chatter. We pulled over at mile 56 for an emergency convoy meeting, and I watched in my mirrors as the other trucks appeared to park behind me, their air brakes hissing and diesel engines idling in the frigid air. When I climbed down from my cab and walked back to check on the other drivers, all three trucks were clearly visible and accounted for. Rodriguez, Patterson, and Williams all looking concerned but solid and real in the harsh glare of our combined headlights. But Patterson and Williams looked wrong somehow, pale and shaken as if they had seen something that had fundamentally altered their understanding of the world. Patterson spoke first, his voice trembling despite years of experience driving Alaska's most dangerous roads. "We need to compare notes here, because according to my radio, there have been 6 trucks in this convoy for the last 50 miles. I've been hearing voices of drivers who aren't supposed to be here, people calling in position reports and road conditions from trucks that don't exist." Williams nodded grimly and pointed back toward the highway where we had just been traveling. "I've been following a truck with no license plate for most of this trip. The driver keeps waving at me in his mirrors, but I can't see his face clearly, like it's always in shadow even when my headlights are shining directly on his cab." Rodriguez made the decision that probably saved all our lives, though we didn't understand the full implications at the time. "We're breaking convoy effective immediately. Everyone drives solo from this point forward. No radio contact until we reach Dead Horse. Whatever's happening here, we're not going to figure it out tonight, and staying together seems to be making it worse." As we prepared to pull back onto the highway and continue our journeys alone, I took one final look at the convoy in my mirrors. Has been collecting trucks and drivers since the first convoy rolled north toward the oil fields in 1974. I've never run convoy on that stretch again, preferring the loneliness of solo driving to the terror of discovering that some of your fellow travelers might not be entirely real, might be echoes of drivers who disappeared years ago, but continue making their runs through eternity, always looking for new members to join their phantom convoy that travels forever through Alaska's endless winter night. My name is Annie Torres, and I've been running supplies to Alaska's most remote communities for 11 years, specializing in emergency deliveries to places so isolated that a missed shipment can mean the difference between life and death for entire villages. Coldfoot Station sits at mile 175 of the Dalton Highway, the last outpost of civilization before you enter the true wilderness of the Brooks Range, where the landscape becomes so hostile and empty that most people can't comprehend the scale of desolation that awaits beyond that final truck stop. What happened to me there last December taught me that some places exist in multiple states simultaneously, shifting between what they are and what they once were, trapping visitors in temporal loops that can last forever if you're not careful about which version of reality you choose to accept. I pulled into Coldfoot around midnight after fighting through 3 days of brutal weather conditions that had turned what should have been a routine supply run into an endurance test that pushed both my truck and my sanity to their breaking points. The station appeared normal from the outside, with its familiar cluster of buildings and fuel pumps illuminated by security lights that cut through the Arctic darkness. But something felt subtly wrong in ways that I couldn't immediately identify. The place was too quiet, lacking the usual sounds of diesel engines and generator hums that provide the constant background noise of any functioning truck stop in Alaska's wilderness. Inside the main building, the attendant was someone I'd never seen before despite making regular stops at Coldfoot for more than a decade. He was a young man, maybe in his 20s, with pale skin and a friendly smile that seemed genuine enough, but his eyes were completely black. Not dark brown or deep blue, but the absolute black of deep space between stars. He moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been working at the station for years, navigating around the counter and equipment with familiarity that suggested long experience, yet I was certain I had never encountered him before. "Coffee's fresh," he said, gesturing toward the pot with hands that seemed too white, too smooth for someone who worked with machinery and fuel pumps in sub-zero temperatures. "Made it special for you, Annie. We've been expecting you." Hearing my name spoken by this stranger sent ice water through my veins, because I hadn't given him my name or shown him any identification, and the friendly tone of his voice carried undertone, wearing a jacket and cap that looked like 1980s vintage, another in gear that seemed to come from the 1990s, and the third dressed in early 2000s trucking company uniforms that had gone out of style years ago. All three men had the same black eyes as the attendant, and when they looked up at me in unison, their faces carried expressions of patient waiting, as if they had been sitting in those chairs for decades. "You boys heading north?" I asked, trying to maintain some semblance of normal conversation, while my instincts screamed warnings about the fundamental wrongness of everything I was experiencing. They smiled in perfect synchronization, and the one in the 1980s jacket spoke for all of them. "We've been heading north for a very long time, Annie. Some trips take longer than others. Some trips never really end." His voice had the same echoing quality as the attendant's, as if it was coming from somewhere much larger and more hollow than the small truck stop we were sitting in. I checked my watch and discovered the first concrete evidence that something impossible was happening at Coldfoot Station. My watch showed 12:15 a.m., but the clock on the wall displayed 11:47 p.m., while the coffee shop's register showed 12:33 a.m. on its digital readout. Every timepiece in the building was displaying a different time, creating a temporal confusion that made my head spin as I tried to understand what was happening to the normal flow of minutes and hours. "What time is it really?" I asked the attendant, hoping for some rational explanation for the chronological chaos surrounding me. He smiled wider, and for just a moment, his entire face flickered like a television with poor reception, revealing something underneath that was definitely not human, something ancient and patient and hungry for company in ways that transcended normal human loneliness. "Time moves differently here, Annie. Some folks arrive and decide they like it so much they never leave. Others try to leave but discover they never really arrive anywhere else. The question isn't what time it is. The question is whether you're ready to stop counting time altogether." That's when I realized I couldn't hear my truck idling in the parking lot outside, the familiar rumble of my diesel engine that should have been audible through the station's windows and doors. I ran to the window and looked out at a parking lot to understand what it's like to spend your life moving between places without ever really arriving anywhere. I bolted through the door and into the Arctic night, and my truck was exactly where I had left it, engine running and heater maintaining the warm temperature inside my cab. But as I pulled back onto the Dalton Highway and looked in my rearview mirror, Coldfoot Station was completely dark, every light extinguished, looking like it had been closed and abandoned for years. Research later revealed that Coldfoot Station closes at 10 p.m. during winter months, meaning it had been closed for more than 2 hours before I arrived. Yet I had spent 30 minutes inside drinking coffee and talking with people who may have been trapped there since their own trucks broke down decades ago, still waiting for parts that will never arrive, still planning trips north that will never be completed. My name is Michael Chang, and I've been running ice roads through Alaska's most hostile territories for 15 years, specializing in winter deliveries when temperatures drop so low that exposed skin freezes in under 60 seconds, and mechanical failures can mean death before help arrives. I've seen nature at its most brutal and unforgiving, witnessed storms that can bury entire highways in minutes, and cold snaps that turn diesel fuel into gel. But I thought I understood the rules that govern survival in Alaska's wilderness, until I encountered something on the Denali Highway that defied every law of physics and biology I had ever learned. It was mid-February during one of the worst cold snaps in recent memory, with temperatures that hadn't risen above -40 degrees in more than a week, and wind chills that made the air itself feel like a living weapon against anything foolish enough to venture outside. I was fighting my way through a ground blizzard that reduced visibility to zero while hauling emergency medical supplies to a research station that had been cut off from civilization for 3 weeks, supplies that could mean the difference between life and death for people who were counting on me to get through conditions that had already claimed 2 other delivery attempts. The blizzard was moving snow like liquid across the landscape, creating drifts that appeared and disappeared with supernatural speed, reshaping the highway into an alien terrain where familiar landmarks vanished under tons of wind-blown powder. That's when I encountered the obstruction that forced me to stop. A massive snowdrift that had formed across both lanes of the highway, rising at least 8 feet high and stretching for approximately 50 feet in length, completely blocking any possibility of continuing my journey without first clearing a path through the accumulated snow. I grabbed my emergency shovel and stepped out into the howling wind, immediately feeling the brutal cold penetrate through multiple layers of insulation designed to protect against exactly these conditions. The drift appeared normal from a distance, just another obstacle created by Alaska's relentless winter. But as I approached with my shovel, I noticed something that shouldn't have been possible in temperatures that were cold enough to kill most living things in minutes. The snowdrift was warm, not melting warm but body warm, radiating heat that I could feel through my heavy gloves when I placed my hands against its surface. I began digging into the drift, expecting to find the usual packed snow and ice that conscious. Something that was using this blizzard as camouflage for purposes I couldn't begin to understand. I stepped back from the breathing snowdrift and called out into the howling wind. "Hello? Is someone trapped in there? Can you hear me?" Hoping desperately that I would discover some rational explanation for what I was experiencing. Perhaps a person who had become buried in the drift and whose breathing was creating the movement I observed. But instead of a human response, the breathing stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete that even the wind seemed to pause in its relentless assault on the frozen landscape, as if the entire storm was waiting to see what would happen next. The silence lasted for nearly a minute before the breathing resumed, but now it was different, more deliberate, more aware, as if whatever was inside the drift had awakened and was studying me with the same curiosity that I was studying it. I started digging again, faster this time, driven by a mixture of fear and desperate hope that I could help whoever or whatever was trapped beneath tons of snow. But 3 feet down, I hit something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was skin, pale white skin that was smooth and cold but definitely alive, pulsing with a slow heartbeat that I could feel through my gloves when I pressed my palms against its surface. The skin was stretched over something massive, something that extended far beyond the boundaries of what I was excavating, suggesting a creature of enormous proportions that was using the snowdrift as either shelter or camouflage. The skin rippled under my touch like the surface of deep water disturbed by something moving far beneath, and I could feel muscles shifting and adjusting as whatever I had discovered began to stir in response to my intrusion. That's when it spoke to me, not with words that I heard through my ears, but with a voice that resonated directly inside my skull, bypassing normal hearing entirely and communicating with me on some primitive level that existed before language developed. "Thank you for waking me, Michael Chang," the voice said, and hearing my full name spoken by this impossible entity made me understand that I was dealing with something that possessed knowledge and awareness far beyond anything that should exist in Alaska's frozen wilderness. I was having such pleasant dreams of warmer times, of summers that lasted for decades, and unwilling to witness the full transformation of the breathing snowdrift into whatever massive creature had been hiding beneath its white camouflage, and drove away at dangerous speeds despite the ground blizzard conditions that made visibility nearly impossible. When I reported the blocked road to the highway department the next morning, they dispatched a snow removal crew to clear the obstruction, but the crew chief called me personally later that day with news that chilled me more than any Arctic wind. There was no snowdrift blocking the highway, no obstruction of any kind, and the road appeared to have been naturally clear for days or weeks. But he had found something else at the exact location I had described, a perfect circle of dead vegetation 50 feet in diameter where nothing would grow, as if something enormous had been resting there for so long that it had drained the life from the earth itself, sleeping through countless winters while dreaming of ancient summers that existed before humans walked the frozen lands of Alaska. My name is Robert Kim, and I've been navigating Alaska's most isolated highways for 17 years, hauling everything from construction materials to emergency supplies across distances that test both man and machine to their absolute limits. The loneliness of these routes can drive some drivers to the edge of sanity, spending days or weeks without human contact while fighting through conditions that would kill most people, which is why seeing other trucks on the road usually brings a sense of relief and connection to the broader community of drivers who understand the unique challenges of wilderness hauling. What I encountered on the Alaska Highway last November taught me that not all convoys are what they appear to be, and that some drivers continue making their runs long after their final delivery should have been completed. It was approaching 2 a.m. during one of those crystal-clear winter nights, when the temperature drops so low that the air itself seems to crystallize, creating an otherworldly silence that makes every sound carry for miles across the frozen landscape. I was southbound on the Alaska Highway, returning from a supply run to a logging camp near the Canadian border, when I spotted them in my headlights about a mile ahead, a convoy of what appeared to be 8 trucks running in tight formation through the darkness. At first glance, they looked like any other group of drivers traveling together for safety and companionship, maintaining proper spacing and convoy discipline as they navigated the treacherous highway. But something was fundamentally wrong with what I was observing, details that became more apparent as I closed the distance between us. The trucks were running completely dark, no headlights, no taillights, no running lights or reflectors, nothing but barely visible silhouettes moving through the night like ghosts made of steel and chrome. I tried raising them on my CB radio, cycling through all the standard channels and calling out the traditional greetings that connect drivers across thousands of miles of lonely highway. Southbound convoy, this is northbound Robert. You boys running without lights? Come back if you copy. Nothing but static answered me, the deep rolling silence that fills the airwaves when you're the only person transmitting across hundreds of square miles of wilderness. As I drew closer to the phantom convoy, I could make out more disturbing details that challenged my understanding of what was possible on Alaska's highways. The trucks were all older models, 19th. The most unsettling aspect of the encounter was the complete absence of sound that should have accompanied 8 fully loaded tractor-trailers moving at highway speed. My own diesel engine was roaring as I maintained pace with the convoy, but I couldn't hear any noise from the other trucks. No engine rumble, no tire noise on asphalt, no air brake hisses or transmission whines. Nothing but the eerie silence of machines that moved without making any acknowledgement of the physical laws that govern internal combustion engines and mechanical systems. I pulled alongside the lead truck to get the driver's attention, hoping to establish some form of communication, or at least understand why they were traveling in such a dangerous manner. The cab was clearly illuminated by my headlights, and I could see a figure behind the wheel, hands positioned properly at 10 and 2 o'clock, eyes focused straight ahead on the highway. But the driver wasn't moving at all. No adjustments to steering, no shifting positions, no acknowledgement of my presence alongside his truck, just sitting there like a mannequin or statue positioned to look like someone operating a vehicle. That's when my CB radio exploded with voices, multiple transmissions overlapping and interfering with each other in a cacophony of communication that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. But instead of normal trucker chatter about road conditions and weather reports, every voice was saying exactly the same thing in perfect unison, creating a chilling chorus that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. Join the convoy, Robert Kim. Join the convoy. There's always room for one more driver. Join the convoy and never drive alone again. I looked at the other trucks in the formation and realized with growing horror that every driver was identical, sitting in exactly the same position, with exactly the same blank expression, all of them staring straight ahead with the mechanical precision of automated systems, rather than living human beings. They had turned to look at me now, 8 identical faces in 8 different cabs, all wearing the same empty smile that never reached their eyes, all moving in perfect synchronization, as if controlled by a single consciousness that operated multiple bodies. The convoy began to spread out around my truck, boxing me in with practiced precision that suggested they had performed this maneuver many times before. I was trapped in the middle of 8 ghost trucks on a deserted highway. The entire convoy vanished, as if they had never existed at all. When I turned my lights back on seconds later, the road was empty in both directions, nothing but fresh asphalt stretching endlessly through the night, without any sign that 8 trucks had been traveling alongside me just moments before. But I could still hear them on my CB radio, faint voices cutting through the static with their eternal invitation. Join the convoy, Robert Kim. We're still here, always here, waiting for drivers who understand what it means to never stop moving, never reach a final destination. Research later revealed that in 1983, a convoy of 8 trucks was involved in a catastrophic pileup during a sudden blizzard on this exact stretch of highway. All drivers killed instantly when black ice sent the lead truck into an uncontrollable skid that triggered a chain reaction collision. But according to other drivers who travel this route regularly, the convoy is still out there, running the same route they died on, always looking for new members to join their endless journey through eternity.